Before we begin, take a moment to make observations about the images you see. Pause the video and share 4 observations with the members in your group. When each person has shared, you may start the video again. In this section, we are focusing on the components of an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a community made up of living organisms and their non-living components. So the biotic things are those living things in a habitat, so things such as plants or animals or even bacteria. While abiotic factors, A meaning not, and biotic, the living, so not living, abiotic factors are those non-living things that are in a habitat. For instance, things like oxygen or air, water, rocks, soil, or minerals. Go ahead and draw this table into your notebook. Pause the video and resume when you've finished. Now that you have a T-chart with biotic and abiotic at the top, you're going to go back and look at the pictures that I showed you previously and identify a number of things that can be biotic factors and things that can be abiotic factors. Here you go. Go ahead and pause the video while you complete the T-chart. Now that you've completed the T-chart, take a look at some examples that I've provided. Some biotic factors in the previous photos are things such as grass, the mosquito, the lion, and trees. While abiotic factors would be things such as the water, clouds, the temperature, or you could say the thermal energy, and air. Now here's a question. Think about how a bat interacts with both the biotic and abiotic factors in its habitat. Go ahead and pause the video and discuss with your neighbors. Some of the examples you may have come up with were that bats eat insects or bats eat fruit. So the fruit and the insects, those would be biotic factors. You could say that bats need water, which is an abiotic factor. You could also say that bats sometimes live in trees. So living in trees would be a biotic factor. Or that bats can live in caves, so abiotic caves. Bats use echolocation, right, to navigate, to move around. So therefore, they need air in order to do that. So that's a big form. They also need air to move around. If they're using their wings to flap around, they need air to give them that lift. So those are just some examples of how bats can interact with both the biotic and abiotic factors in its everyday life. Here's a question I'll pose to you. Why do bats need elephants? Turn and talk with your neighbor, go ahead and pause the video, and come up with some ideas about how they might depend on each other. So there was a research project I worked on in college, and one of the things we did was we were looking at bats. And this is a photo that we took of some of the bats that we caught. But in order to find these bats, we did some tracking. And rather than just relying on sonar technologies, we actually drove around at night and followed elephants. And the reason we did this was that elephants are huge animals. They have to eat all day, every day. Not necessarily all day, but many hours of the day. And when they're eating, these ones in South Africa, they really go for the branches of trees. And they wrap their trunk around the trees and they yank these branches off, really disrupting the area in which they're eating in. And so as they're walking through, and elephants move around in herds, so big group of elephants, and they're all eating, and they're all yanking branches off trees, Well, insects also live in trees. So if there's insects in the trees and they're sleeping and hanging out, when their branch gets yanked, they're not just going to go, oh, okay, I'm going to hang out. I'm going to sit here and wait till the elephant eats me. They are going to jump or fly away. And as they are flying away in mass numbers, and bats like to eat insects, why might it be a good idea for bats to follow elephants around? Just something to think about. So one of the other things that you noticed in your other readings were this idea of energy transfer through a food chain. And this is not a new topic for you. You're all very familiar with the idea of a food chain. But a food chain is really focusing on the flow of energy. Now, we've been talking about energy for the whole year, and you know it's the focus. And so now we're getting into ecosystems, and it's still the focus. And how does energy move from one place to another? Why does matter need energy? Now, organisms, living things, obviously need energy to survive. So a food chain isn't focusing on food, it's focusing on where an organism gets its energy. So notice this definition. It says the flow of energy that is transferred from one organism to another. So if you look at the image below, you have all of these red arrows that are showing the flow of energy. So you have energy from the sun, right? Radiant energy. The grass needs that to make its food or to transform that radiant energy into chemical energy. And then that energy moves from the grass to the grasshopper when the grasshopper consumes the grass. And then the energy moves from the grasshopper to the snake as the snake consumes the grasshopper. So one key important point here is this idea that arrows are showing the flow of energy. And this goes for all food chains and food webs. You're showing energy moving from one organism to the next. In addition to talking about the flow of energy and the role it plays in a food chain, another important aspect is the idea of how matter cycles throughout the food chain. And so when we use the word cycle, we think of a circle. And so it continues forever and ever, whereas the flow of energy, as you know from earlier units, it just transforms. So you start out with radiant energy, it transforms into chemical energy, and while some of that chemical energy transfers from one organism to the other, some of it is also transformed into thermal energy and is wasted out of the system. When it comes to cycling of matter, you have different nutrients such as carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, water, phosphorus, and oxygen that all move through a food chain through different organisms. Take a look here at the nitrogen cycle. You can see how nitrogen flows from the soil into the plants, and then from the plants to the bunny rabbit. And then, assuming the bunny rabbit dies, the decomposers break it down and put that nitrogen back into the soil, and the cycle repeats itself. You could also look at how carbon cycles through different organisms as well. Again, the emphasis is on a cycle here rather than the flow of energy. So you can see how there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So carbon is a main component of carbon dioxide. It can go into plants through photosynthesis. Animals can eat those plants and then breathe out the carbon dioxide. Decomposers can also break down those plants and animals and put it into fossils, which can later be used for things such as oil, coal, and gas, and for combustion. Then pollution puts that back into the atmosphere as well. So while each of these images emphasize two specific nutrients that get cycled through organisms, you do not need to know all these details, but just understand the importance of them moving through a food chain or food web. If you take a look at this energy pyramid, it does a really good job modeling how energy moves through a system. It has the role of decomposers and how they can relate to each of the different levels of organisms. It emphasizes how nutrients are recycled back into the primary producers. It identifies that the sun is contributing that original source of energy. And it's also showing how energy is lost as heat, but we know it's really lost as thermal energy. If we go back to the original image that I showed you with the food chain, this also does a pretty good job showing how nutrients get cycled back in to grass. It also has other nutrients, such as water, being contributed. Now, the thing is, as we know, no model is ever perfect or complete. So the challenge for you is, how do we make a better model showing not only the flow of energy, but also the cycling of nutrients through each of these different parts?